Before we get into adding muscles to our character, I just want to take a quick look at the basics of how these muscles work that come with cat. So if we go to create helpers and then choose cat objects, you'll see that we have a cat muscle and a cat strand. Now, the cat strand is actually a little bit more what you might think of as a muscle, and the way that you create them is if I just hop into the front view here by dragging out 4 points. You have a start point, and then you're going to drag out a little Bezier handle, and then you're going to click again to point that Bezier handle, and then you're going to have one more and a last Bezier handle, and it's going to create a number of spheres in between those that is going to be our muscle. Now there are a few different places that you can select. Basically, these dummy objects at the end, muscle strand end, will move the entire muscle. So if you select either one of them, you can move one end, or if you select them both at the same time, you can move kind of the entire object. You can also move the entire object just by selecting the actual muscle strand. So everything's kind of parented here for ease of use. You also have this kind of controller here, which you can see behaves very much like a Bezier handle. So we can move these to kind of deform or position the muscle as we would want to on our rig. And if I just break out here, we can move in any direction as well. If I just go into the modify panel with any part of that muscle selected, you can see that there's a bunch of different parameters to adjust. The first one is whether this is going to behave as a mesh or a bone, and that's really has to do with skinning, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But basically, if you want this to be selectable with skin, you need to make these bones, and it will make a bone for every one of these spheres. And if you want to use something like skin wrap, you can choose mesh here. I have basic muscle properties, whether it's a left, right, or a middle muscle, and the mirror axes, and whether I actually want to see these handles. Sometimes if you have a lot of objects in the scene, a lot of muscles, you may not want to see these handles, and you can also adjust their size so that they're easily selectable. You can adjust the number of spheres. So if you're going to do a bones setup, it's really pretty good idea to start to adjust these. And that is because you're going to get a bone for or an envelope for each one that you select. So you may want to go down to just 3 different spheres so that you just get 3 bones or envelopes in your skin selection. Or if you need finer detail, you can make this a lot finer. I don't see much need for going too far past 7. Under that we have our profile curve, and this is just how it is scaling these guys. So after you've positioned and everything like that, you can adjust the profile of this in any way that you want to be heavy on one end, heavy on the other, and you can even add in more points. So if we want to go in and add in a point, we can bring that in and kind of adjust these there. So it gives you a lot of flexibility as to the shape of the muscle editing the profile curve. Under that we have squash and stretch, and basically how much we'll be able to squash and stretch this as we move these pieces away from each other and whatever angles they reach. So you can see that's with squash and stretch enabled, and if we disable it, it's just going to kind of keep the same size. So usually for setup you want to have that disabled, and once we go into animation we'll start enabling the squash and stretch. So those are the basic things that are about this muscle strand here. And let's just take a look at the other muscle type. So I'm going to delete this, and let's just hop into perspective view, go to create, helpers, cat objects, and create a cat muscle. What this does is creates a muscle plane. And this is really useful for adjusting things like shoulders and other areas that get strange pinching. You basically would, conform this to the shape of any like larger, maybe a pec muscle or the shoulder muscle, in order to retain the shape and form underneath the mesh. This is made up of a bunch of control points as well. You can see that you have endpoints, and it behaves pretty much like a patch surface. If you go in, you can see that we'll set edge faces, and this is made up of a bunch of different planes. If I start to move them this way, you can kind of see how they deform. So basically we have our corner points, And then we have our Bezier handles, which will adjust the way that those are set up. And we can adjust the tessellation or resolution of this pretty easily. So let's just go over to Modify. And you can see that we have a lot of the same stuff that we had for the strand. We have whether you want them to be bones or mesh. And if they're bones, you're going to get a bone for each one of these pieces. And you can see how they're kind of broken apart there. And if they're mesh, then they'll kind of be all one piece. Under Properties, we can adjust the length and width segments of how many we get. So if you need this to be smoother for some reason, particularly with skin wrap, then you may want to adjust those there. So you can adjust how many length and width segments you have. And the same parameters for whether it's a left, middle, or right muscle, and the mirror axes. We have our visible handles, and whether we want to see handles that go towards the middle as well. So if you need a little bit more control, you can say that you want to see those middle handles and position those too. I usually leave them off. Now, one thing that this muscle has that the strand does not have is this really cool collision detection. And this allows us to have sliding skin. And you may actually use this in conjunction with the strand muscle. So if you had the strand muscle underneath this type of muscle, you could have some sliding skin over it because you'd still get the deformation, but it wouldn't pull all the vertices with the skin wrap. So let me just adjust this slightly. And I'll bring all these guys in together. Like so. And just move these up to just try and start to shape something that might look like a muscle. And I'm just going to give us some more segments to deal with. And we'll change our color too. Okay, so here is our muscle setup. And I want to take a look at using some deformers. So we're going to use something real simple. We'll just use a sphere. So let's grab a sphere, and I don't know that we need that many. If you're going to use proxy objects or things that are riding underneath or being collision objects, it's a good idea to keep the polygon count as low as possible because those are going to create collisions. And now we'll select our muscle. Under collision detection, we're going to choose Add, and we'll pick our sphere. So now our sphere is in there, and as we move the sphere, you can see that it's deforming the mesh above it. So this will kind of slide over. And, depending on what kind of mesh resolution you have and what you need there, we'll just crank this up so that we can really see it sliding over. But I wouldn't really recommend being at this higher resolution. Usually you can get pretty good sliding skin at a lower res. So you can see that this will deform underneath it. So, for instance, if you had, some sort of muscle or joint object that was underneath, either a strand or just a basic primitive object like this sphere. You can adjust that, and this stuff will slide underneath, and then what you would want is to have skin wrap, this being deformed by the skin wrap there, so that you can have these things kind of going underneath there, which is really pretty neat, and you can work from the other side as well. So if we come in here, one way that you need to do for this is to go into the object, select the collision object, and you want to say invert. And that way it's going to invert whatever it is that you have, and it'll kind of push in from the top. So this is really pretty cool, and we'll be doing something like this for our character so that we can take that rock and we can sit it on top of their shoulders, and you can deform pieces like that. So not only can you take this from, a muscle bulging out system, but if you had something that was going to punch your character in the face, or, they were going to lean up against something with a very large stomach or something like that, you can have these different collision objects affect it, which is really pretty nice. So that's the basics of setting up your these two different muscle objects and some things that you can do with them. There's really a lot that you can do, and we'll just continue on and add some muscles to our character next. So now that we have the basic rigging and simple skinning done on this character, I'd like to take a look at putting some muscles using cat muscle. So we can see this character kind of walking here, we're going to add some muscles to this leg. So let's just hop into the layer manager, and we'll turn on the muscles layer, which doesn't have anything in it yet, and just check it so that's the active layer. And let's also hide our skin so that we're just looking at the bones setup. Now we want to set up our muscles in the kind of standard pose for our rig and not the animated pose right away. So let's just go into the motion panel and turn off animation mode so that the character is still here in the front. We're going to set these up from the back, so change to the back view. And we're going to go over to Create, Helpers, and choose CAD Objects. And here we have two different types of muscles. We're going to choose the muscle strand. And muscle strands are pretty easy. We're just going to create a muscle here for this leg. So let's just click and drag. And then we'll click one more time. And then we'll go over here. We'll click. And then we'll click one more time. And that basically sets 4 different points up for our muscle. The muscle is made up of these different spheres in the center. And if we just go into wireframe, you can see it has this kind of Bezier helpers that control it. You have this piece, which will control kind of the arc of that muscle, as well as this one on this side. And then you have the end point, and those were the 4 points that we created when we created this muscle. So if we just go back into smooth highlights, I want to align this with our character's leg. So what I'm going to do is just select the end point here, and then I'm going to go up and choose Quick Align, and I'm going to align that point to that portion of the leg, and then we'll select the other bottom point here, and we're going to quick align that to this top leg, and that should kind of position it to where we want it. And now we can just kind of go in and adjust the way that we want this to look. And we may want to toggle the skin on and off for this, and just kind of move this, Bezier handle back and forth so that we can adjust how this is going to work. So probably like that. And I may want to bring this down just so that I get a little bit better angle for deforming when we're bulging. And let's just toggle the character on and off so we can kind of see what's going on here. So we may want to move that up there and just position it however you like. You can also change the color if you wish to something that is more muscle-like. And the next thing to do is just link these 2 controller objects to the portion of the leg or the body that you want, and I'm just going to link them to the bone. So we'll grab Select and Link, and I'm going to link this one to that top bone there. Make sure that we have that correct. There we go. And we'll hop into wireframe. We'll grab this and link it over there. And we'll just do this in wireframe too, just so I can be sure that we have it linked correctly, and we do. So now when we hop back in to animation mode, and select the character, go into animation mode, this muscle should follow along with the character. Now what we'll do is just go in and add a little bit of squash and stretch to this muscle. So I'm going to select the muscle, and I'm going to go to the Modify panel, and you can see that it has a few different parameters that we can deal with here. And what we want to do is just scroll down to the squash and stretch, and we want to say Enable. And you can see it kind of stretch out there as it's long, and when it comes back, it gets squashed a bit. Now, the important part about this is to kind of set where it's going to be at rest, or its relaxation state. So you kind of want to pick somewhere in the leg where it's not all the way contracted, which would be about here, and it's not all the way out, which would be kind of that touch right there. So we'll go probably maybe somewhere like 11 or 12 is kind of in the middle. And just click on Set Relax State, and you can see that it will set that in here. So now when the leg moves out a bit, it'll stretch, and when it moves back a bit, it will squash. And right now it's not super predominant or clear that that's happening. And that depends on a couple of different things, where it happens to be positioned on the leg and these Bezier handles as well. But what we can do is adjust the multiplier. So if we bring this all the way up to, let's say, 15, you can see in this squash state, it will really, bulge up, and at the stretch, it'll really thin out. Okay, so I don't know that 15 is actually where we want to go. Maybe we'll bring it down a little bit, but for different circumstances, it's different. So we can change this multiplier maybe back down to 10, and we can be happy with that. So now we have that set up, and that looks pretty good. What we'll do is just add the other muscle to the other side. So let's go and hop out of animation mode. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we tell what side this muscle is on. So we're going to say that this is the character's right leg, which it is. So we're going to check the right. And then I'm just going to copy this muscle over here. So just shift drag, copy it, and it'll bring everything else with it. And then on this one, I'm going to tell it that this is the left muscle. And I'll go back to the right muscle, and I'll say that I want to copy the strand settings and select on this one, and we'll say paste strand settings. So this will put it in the position as well as all the correct strand settings that we just made up on the other side, which is pretty useful. So we can just hop back into wireframe and do our linking. So we'll link this muscle. We're going to link these controller objects that control the ends to the proper leg bone. And then when we hop back into animation mode, both of these should be stretching and deforming the way that we set them up. I think this is still a little bit heavy, but I think for the demo, this will work pretty well. You might, normally have a lot of different muscles set up where you have 4 or 5 in the leg and along the back, but we're just going to set up these 2 simple ones right now. Okay, so next what I want to take a look at is skinning these to the body. So when we do that, we're definitely going to want to be out of animation mode so that we're in this kind of set mode here. And let's bring our character there, and we can see the muscle and how it is set up on either side. And there's 2 ways that we can do this. If I select this muscle, you can see that the muscle can either be of a mesh or a bone type. And if it's a mesh, you want to use something like skin wrap in order to skin this to the character. If it's a bone and you're going out to some sort of game setup, it'll make each one of those little spheres a bone, which is really pretty helpful. And then you can select each one as a bone through just regular skin, and that will work and, as I said, export to your game engine. I find that it's a little easier to set them up as a mesh if you're going to be working in 3ds Max mostly, because you don't have as many envelopes to play with, and it's pretty easy to set up. So before I do that, what I'd like to do is, because this is kind of at a pumped up state already, I usually like to drop the multiplier. So we'll hide this. And before we skin it, because this is pretty close to our squashed state, I want to go into the multiplier and bring that back down to maybe half of this, or maybe even 1. So we'll set it back to 1 for both of these, just so that before we skin this, we don't have that deformation. And then we'll go back to the character here. We're going to select the character, and we're going to add a skin wrap. So I'll add a skin wrap to this guy. And we're just going to add, and I'm going to press H in order to bring up the select by name. And we want to grab our muscle strands. So they should be in here at the bottom. They're helpers, muscle strand 1 and muscle strand 2. I'm going to pick those. And now those will be deforming our character. And we can go in and adjust the vertex deformation and fall off. But if they're pretty close to the skin, they should work pretty well by default. And now when we go back, we'll select our muscle strands and we'll set that multiplier back up in the squash and stretch. And you can see that's going to bulge the layout, and that's about the amount of bulge that we'll get out of the leg. And now we can go and actually, let's just hide our character. Let's select our rig, put it back into animation mode, and we'll play this back. So there we go there. And let's just bring our character, hide our muscles, and hide our bones so that we can just see the way that the mesh deforms. And you can see that you get that muscle bulging and stretching that's deforming the mesh underneath, which looks pretty good right now. Okay, so one more thing that I want to add to this is some sort of jiggle or bounce to the muscle as it snaps into place. So let's hide our character again, bring back the bones and the muscle. And there's two different ways that we can do something like this. The first is actually on these Bezier handles. We could apply a spring controller here, and it would just kind of bounce around and affect the way that these Bezier handles move, and that would give us a little bit of jiggle on our leg. The other thing that I find maybe a little more simple is just to apply a flex modifier to this object itself. One nice thing about this muscle system is you can apply modifiers to it because it is a mesh, and you can do all sorts of things with those modifiers. So if, for instance, we wanted to add a push modifier, we could do that, and it would push this in and out. It's a little far. Pretty easily, and you could even animate that if you wanted to. Or you could apply an effect region or all sorts of other things that would kind of go with this object, which is pretty interesting. And for that, what we're going to do is just apply flex, because that's going to give us some simple, fairly fast secondary action. So I'm going to apply a flex modifier, and we'll just play this back. So you can see we really get some bounciness in that leg. And let's bring our character up and get rid of the bones. And you can see here it's really kind of bouncing the leg around. Okay. Now there's a couple things that I'd like to do for this flex. So let's just go in and hide our character. And you can see that at the root, we're getting where at the end of the muscle where it would be attached to the bone, it's kind of flopping around there, which is maybe not ideal. So all we have to do is go into Flex, choose Edge Vertices into Sub-Object mode, and we'll grab these guys here, hold down Control, and grab these guys in the end, so that these are edge vertices and only the center is going to kind of move around. And we got some nice jiggle there. Maybe too much jiggle, but we'll kind of go with that for right now. And we can just go over to the other side, and we can apply the flex modifier there. Immediately I'll hop in, go to edge vertices, and we'll grab those guys there, as well as these ones on this end. And then hop back out. So now we can bring our character back, hide our muscles, and you can see that that is definitely jumping around a bit. If you want to get a slightly better look at it, you might go in here. I'm going to set the start time to 0 and just turn off real time. Or you can actually do, a preview animation so that you can see how this is playing back. I'll go back, turn real time back on. And it's a bit floppy right now, and it's also, if you take a notice, it's a bit floppy kind of right here in the front. So one thing I want to do is just kind of adjust those edges, because I'd like probably more of the action just to happen back here. We'll hide this here. We'll bring our muscles back and just go to those edge vertices, and I'll probably expand that on this edge to right about there. And we can do the same on the other side. So this way we get a little bit better control over, what's deforming and when, and maybe we'll just grab only these ones on the top here and have the bottom work or what have you. And now we can go back. And you can see that we're getting much less deformation down towards the knee where we really wouldn't want it, and only on the backside of the leg here. So lastly, I would say that this is probably a little intense. It's nice to have it set up like this for the demo, but probably bring that flex down 0.5 on either side just so that it's not quite as in your face, and you'd likely have a lot more of these muscles on the character. But this is a quick and good way to kind of go up and set up some muscles for your character. You can put these, all over the body, and then you get, some nice bulging, deformation, and secondary action out of your character. And again, yeah, it's pretty cool that this stuff is included in 2011 so that you have a little bit of something to use there.